great to be part of the discussion. And I'm sorry I joined late. It seemed that with what I heard so far, I missed a great deal of insightful suggestions. And it's good as well to talk about the private sector and the financial sector leaders' potential work and the foundations and their presence. Because in different rooms, not this one, I've been seeing a lot of generous assumptions about what the private sector can do to fill the gaps. And otherwise, actually, when we see rooms full of private sector leaders without the regulators and the government representatives, we see as well this issue of the generous assumption. Super happy to get climate finance closely related to the SDGs. And I'm taking matter here in 3 steps. First, we had the discussions leading on the GST and its outcomes. Next step is discussing seriously what should really be happening on the future of finance beyond the 100 billion, and more importantly, how we are counting the deals, what kind of standards. And this question is going to be raised very often, especially with the recent OECD report that, congratulations, citizens of the world, we reached 100% of the 100 billion. So that would be raising many questions, whether exactly the standards being adopted are the ones that have been expected since 2009, and what kind of standards and measures and methodology that should be adopted for the future in order to figure out, first, the adequate amount that could be coming from traditional sources. Second, with the right incentives, how can we get more resources from additional jurisdictions and from the private sector and foundations. And we need to be mindful to the fact that even when governments commit and pledge, issues related to delivery have been very much questionable. So when we are expecting money to come from private sector and philanthropies, we have their own functions that we need to maximize, and they work based on a completely different incentive structure, as being mentioned in different ways. Having said that, there is an exercise that we did, and with Jay perhaps and others, we spoke about that before, the pipeline of bankable investment projects. With Avi as well, we had many discussions about this pipeline and the role of different players. And this is a serious conversation because many, after Glasgow, started to talk about how can we turn assets into flows, which is basically the title of a report that has a compendium of projects in the pipeline of bankable investable projects. That came out from a discussion that we had with Mark Carney, based on his interesting piece on the country platforms, putting 6 conditions. A very good friend, a sensible man, I told him, let's not make the perfect thing with the good. If I'm meeting from a developing economy, those 6 conditions, my country will be definitely one of the major donors. Expected rule of law, macroeconomic stability, deep financial markets, dealing with currency risk, and pipeline. I said, well, why don't we start with the pipeline and reform as we go? I'm not really undermining the importance of rule of law or the importance of macro stability. But as we have seen with very successful projects, many of you have funded as investors, including major projects, and only insured, like in Morocco or in Egypt. The biggest plants for solar are in those 2 countries in Africa. They were really built on a trust, public-private partnership, and the reforms and offtake agreements and tariff structure were reformed as the investors are really demonstrating that they can do more if reforms are going to be bold enough and progressive enough. So there is a better dialogue by action, not really to start making conditions and not to take any risk or not to put any money. So for those who say that we don't have pipeline of bankable investment projects, we have 420 answers coming from the field, prepared by consultancy firms, supported by investment banks who know their business, with tests coming from the likes of the AFC and IFC and others. Good thing about this pipeline of projects, now we have the demand and the supply, so why they are not meeting? Perhaps some points that have been identified as gaps or tipping points that need to be tackled, including in the business environment. And here the dialogue needs to be different. It's basically about the catalytic funding. It's basically about capacity development, and I'm happy that GFANZ, including GFANZ Africa that I chair now, have been part of the global partnership for capacity development that was launched yesterday. And here there are issues related to catalytic support and the capacity development for the supply to meet the demand eventually. But a few things here. When we're doing this pipeline of projects, I've noticed and others, that an idea about debt swaps at scale need to be considered. And this is a great line of business that could be considered, especially with the serious talk now about more of finance to nature. So debt swaps is a line of business that we have some good tests of. It needs particular arrangement, bold leadership, but it needs as well decent partnership with many of the credit enhancers. So perhaps the issue that was raised earlier related to the subsidy and its relations to the asset class need to be spelled out more as well about what kind of subsidy that we need and what kind of subsidy that we don't. Based in the US or working with the US, know that industrial policies then, generous subsidies through the IRA are back. These subsidies are getting many of the potential projects that we're discussing just last year before Sharm el-Sheikh, not feasible today because they are better built in the US. So here, this is the issue of the kind of subsidies, the spillovers, and the kind of risk that we need to be careful in. Another line of business is coming as well from spillovers with good intentions, like the CBAM. This is an opportunity for business if you are restructuring sectors. And there is a line of insurance as well in this area, including the decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors and dealing with issues related to being compliant with the regulations to export to the US. You can always, as I was telling a couple of ministers from Africa, yes, you can go to the WTO. If you have a partnership with Europe, you can go and complain. That will take years, but meanwhile, you can take that as an incentive to decarbonize, but that needs money and needs technical assistance and support for cement, fertilizers, and these are big industries owned by the private sector from the developing economies with huge investments in India. My final point is on something that came out while we were building the pipeline. It was a dialogue that has many issues with what we're discussing now, including the carbon markets. In your VC this morning, the executive secretary of the UniteActDeliver was here, and I support what he said, that when it comes to standards in some markets, we are in the old Wild West because we don't have standards and we don't really have good disclosure and monitoring. We can complain about that and considering it as one of the gaps, but we know that there is a possibility for partnership for countries that develop their markets. We know that the EU, for instance, lend their advanced knowledge of the carbon markets to China a few years ago. There is nothing that should prevent them, but that needs philanthropies and private sector because the translation is not going to be easy for some of the new initiatives, including ACME, the African Carbon Market Initiative. This is all about finance. NDCs is the final point, really, because NDCs need to be designed different. First, they are not ambitious. Citing figures from Africa, 11 billion for climate finance, that's the real flow. NDCs were telling us that they need only 55 billion, not ambitious enough, because the independent agencies, including UNEP, we say no less than 110 billion is required for the adaptation of African continent as a critical minimum. So NDCs need to be ambitious, and I know why they are not. Perhaps because they are not comprehensive enough, perhaps that some bureaucrats have been self-regulating themselves and repressing their figures because they know if it's going to be ambitious enough, the funding for adaptation is going to be coming 97% from the public purse because the private sector is only 3% so far. And even with the recent reports that came from the Global Center for Adaptation, needs to be really designed differently in order to have adaptation reflected in the future of finance. It was very hard, and I commend the work by many of you around the table, that you tried to translate into NDCs, into plans for strategy and for investable opportunities. They were not designed for that from the very beginning. If we are serious about partnerships, so let's work from now until 2025, get the views of the investors on how to get these NBCs invested, and get the foundations to help, and get the think tanks to contribute, and get as well a great deal of insurance, because if we fail in the adaptation and the mitigation, there will be lots of loss and damages quantified properly. I still cite with a bit of a risk what my good friend Avi has put as the loss and damage per year to be 150 billion. But actually, when we have the fund fully operationalized, we'll have better understanding of the whole dynamics, from loss and damages to adaptation finance to mitigation, not the other way around. A great deal of work is required, perhaps with less use of acronyms, but I had an acronym that I created when I was at the World Bank, and some people said, well, the president of the bank that I work for is asking for a quick note on DRM. So we have two teams. DRM, domestic resource mobilization, that was as old as 2010, not new. And then the other one is disaster risk management. We're in a rush, so the two teams worked, and then it was actually the disaster risk management, because the president was meeting the Prime Minister of Japan. So an acronym for the DPP for the future. It's public-private partnership is nice, but better, again, citing Solid and Jim Baker. The 5 P's are prior preparation prevents poor performance. So this could be good preparation from now until 2025. And we have great leaders waiting for your suggestions, President Lula, with this emphasis that climate action and climate finance is development action and development finance. So let's get rid of this false dichotomy and get the whole matter designed in the right way. Thank you.